I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host for today, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
Good to have you with us. And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Welcome, everybody.
It's a commonplace that the best defense is a good offense. And very few people are more offensive than Donald Trump. He's a bully who's always on the attack. Our first guest, Professor M. Stephen Fish, is a political scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, who has written an op-ed in the New York Times entitled, "Trump Knows Dominance Wins, Someone Tell Democrats." He argues that, quote, Democrats seem to have forgotten that they have their own liberal tradition of dominance politics, and if they embrace it, they would improve their chances of defeating Trumpism. He worries that in a political arena that rewards dominance, and where most people vote for strength and don't really parse policy positions, the Democrats are too weak, too wedded to what he calls a cult of empathy. We will be talking to Professor Fish about what Democrats should be doing to turn the tables on the bully. In the second half of the program, we welcome Phil Turney, who served aboard the USS Liberty as a Navy petty officer. In a largely forgotten and covered-up story, on June 8, 1967, the Liberty was attacked by Israeli planes and torpedo boats. This is in the midst of the 1967 war. Mr. Turney is president of the USS Liberty Veterans Association, which was established to provide support for survivors of the attack. To this day, there are a number of unanswered questions and theories of the case that have never been publicly investigated. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our dogged corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Michelle Obama famously said, "When they go low, we go high." With respect to Donald Trump, is it time to start aiming a little lower? Hannah?
I'm Stephen Fish is a comparative political scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, who specializes in democracy and authoritarianism, religion and politics, and constitutional systems and national legislatures. He writes and comments extensively on international affairs and the rising challenges to democracy in the United States and around the world. And he has published commentary in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Foreign Policy, among other publications. His latest book is Comeback: Routing Trumpism, Reclaiming the Nation, and Restoring Democracy's Edge. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Stephen Fish.
My pleasure. I'm glad to join you.
Welcome indeed, Professor Fish. I want to go to the op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times very recently, May 6th, which caught people's attention. The title was, "Trump Knows Dominance Wins. Someone Tell the Democrats?" And your article focuses that on the point that, and I'm quoting you, politics is a dominance competition, and Mr. Trump is an avid and ruthless practitioner of it. He offers a striking contrast with most Democrats who are more likely to fret over focus group data and issue ever more solemn pledges to control prescription drug prices, end quote. And you add, what these Democrats seem to have forgotten is they have their own liberal tradition of dominance politics, and if they embrace it, they would improve their chances of defeating Trumpism, end quote. Well, let's define dominance. I mean, what form is it? Just words? Images? What?
Well, it's a style of leadership, Ralph. It's a way of leadership, and it can be used for good or ill. A high dominance politician, for one thing, tells you what he or she wants you to believe. A low dominance politician takes polls and reads those and tells you what he or she thinks you want to hear. So a high dominance politician is more forthright and is more intent on making reality, in this case opinion, than simply taking it. That's one feature of dominance. A high dominance politician is conflict acceptant. Doesn't mean that they go seeking conflict, but it means when there's the necessity of engaging in conflict, they dive in. They oftentimes savor it. The low dominance politician is averse to conflict. A high dominance politician is risk acceptant and really enjoys taking risks and plays to win and win big. A low dominance politician kind of hopes to squeak by and is risk averse. High dominance politicians welcome us versus them framing. They know that in politics, no less than in sports or war or corporate life, that there's an us and there's a them. And there's two sides, and they welcome othering their opponents. The low dominance politician is squeamishing about othering anybody. What's more, the high dominance politician is willing and to use provocative and even transgressive language. The low dominance politician is concerned with maintaining norms of decorum and civility. And what you get overall in the high dominance politician then is one who is oftentimes seen as stronger, as tougher, as more decisive, is more committed to his or her own ends than the low dominance politician, who oftentimes is viewed as the opposite of that. You mentioned in your early remarks that the Democrats used to have their own dominance tradition, and they did. I'm looking especially in the book back at that middle third of the 20th century when the Democrats controlled government, both houses of both the White House and both houses of Congress most of that time, between FDR and LBJ. What I find is examples of very high dominance politicians. FDR was an absolute paradigm of this. JFK, Truman, LBJ, MLK were as well.
Well, when I hear that, here's what I think. When people say, and they do say when they're asked, they want a strong leader. They think Trump is strong. Strong about what? Are these people unable to go to the second stage of analysis and exemplify what kind of strength do they want? Do they want strength against minimum wage? Do they want strength against universal health care? Do they want strength against a fair tax system? Why doesn't a pollster ask the follow-up question? Because all we hear is Trump is a strong leader. I want a strong leader.
Well, he is strong against those things, as you mentioned. And until the Democrats are as strong in favor of the minimum wage, until they are as strong in favor of every justice issue we care about, including just preserving democracy in our country, then Trump's strength against those causes is going to possibly win the day. This is the problem, is that dominance can be used for good or for ill. And the Republicans have used it to advance injustice and corruption. And the Democrats need to, as they did in the 20th century very often, use it in favor of justice.
But why is it they're not doing that? What's holding them back? PAC money, corruption of campaigns, lack of character, fear of skeletons in their own closet? What's holding them back if it's so obvious?
I'm not sure it's entirely obvious to them. The Democrats have become obsessed with issues and issue positioning. And they really think you win elections based on where you stand on issues and what kind of policies you offer voters. There's not an iota of evidence in the political science literature or the psychology literature that I can find that voters actually sit down to the kitchen table before elections and say, okay, dear, we're going to sit here with pen and paper. We're going to figure out which party's promises on prescription drug prices more suit our interests. Then we're going to go out and vote for that party. Nobody does that. If anybody ever did that, they don't do it anymore. They vote for the party that they feel like represents people like them. And it's not just a matter of issue positioning. They also vote for leaders who they think are the strongest. Even if people like your policy position, if you're not viewed as able to own your opponents, then they're going to doubt your ability to enact and sustain your policies anyway. People definitely tend to gravitate towards strong leaders. I found this in the data. There's data on, people are asked before elections, which candidate do you think is the most knowledgeable? Which candidate do you think cares most about people like you? And they're asked about which candidate is stronger. The candidate who is viewed as stronger usually wins, right? Whether voters care about how much their politicians care about them is another matter. But strength is kind of it's the virtue that activates all others, just to paraphrase what Winston Churchill said about courage.
Well, let's look at a larger framework here. A few years ago, the New Yorker had a big article on the critical importance of likability. They say likability is one of the most important things that leads voters to vote for a candidate. And then there's other articles written about voters who really want candidates to have empathy and care about people like them, as the poll question is often illustrated. So is this a problem where millions of voters have low expectation levels and very vague expectation levels in terms of bread and butter issues because they don't believe politicians' promises? So they gravitate to more abstract things like he's a strong leader. He says what he thinks and thinks what he says. He's rich and he can't be bought, that they apply, for example, to Trump.
Well, people do care about economic policies, for example, or other kinds of policies, but most people don't follow politics all that closely. And so they don't really follow along and respond as the Democrats would think they would to advertisements, for example, on particular issues. They actually look at a candidate's philosophy or a politician's philosophy, and they kind of trust that that will give them insight into what kind of policies he or she would implement. When it comes to why they vote, what traits matter the most, the Democrats in the American National Election Studies, which they do on electoral years, on presidential election years, basically they canvass respondents on different candidate traits. And the Democrats are always, or almost always, viewed as the party that cares more about people like you, but they still lose about half the time. They are very often regarded as their candidate is regarded as more knowledgeable, although that one isn't quite as consistent. And yet they still lose half the time. But on the question of which one is a stronger leader, the party whose candidate is viewed as the stronger leader never loses. It's interesting. Sometimes it's a tie, but over the course of these surveys, basically, if you're viewed as the stronger leader, that seems to be the best asset of all. So this is a trait that the Democrats completely ignore. They don't seem to think it matters that much. It was innate to people like Kennedy and LBJ, just as it is to Trump. They understood that politics is a dominance competition, not just a competition over who can offer the more attractive policies. The Democrats seem to think it's all about policies. It's not.
To what extent all these genius media advisors who don't have the inhibitions that you described for the Democratic candidates, what are they doing to earn their pay here? Shouldn't his pejorative attacks be responded to? And they're wildly publicized.
First of all, let's start with your last point. They're widely publicized. As long as Trump does this, he controls the airwaves. He is headlines. Every time he says something provocative and outrageous, then it's all Trump all the time in the media, because we live in an age of clickbait, information and infotainment. And the fact is, whoever is actually saying the more interesting, entertaining things is going to get most of the attention. And the fact is, the Democrats can hardly make news. Trump is always news all the time for this very reason. Now, look, the Democrats don't like this name calling. We kind of recoil at such childishness, and we want to stay above the fray. This is absolutely not conducive to doing well against the Republicans. You have to fight back, have to give as good as you get. And this constant refrain that we need to avoid getting down in the gutter with Trump and avoiding such childishness just makes us look like wimps. It made DeSantis look like a wimp in the other Republican candidates in the primary with Trump, makes the Democrats look like wimps with Trump right now. If you're not willing to get down in the mud with your opponent and take him on, you're going to be viewed as a coward, and rightly so. And rightly so. The Democratic messaging machine is for the large part controlled by very well-educated, very progressive white people from the coasts, and they are very concerned with decorum. I really like the contrast you get with some high dominance Democrats right now when it comes to fighting back. I love Jasmine Crockett, second-term Congresswoman from Dallas. Did you see her takedown of Marjorie Taylor Greene the other day? It was absolutely fabulous. She gives better than she gets. And consequently, what she says makes headlines. It goes viral. She thrills Democrats. She cows Republicans. You don't mess with Jasmine Crockett. Another facet of her whole approach is she's having fun. This is a high dominance thing. She's exuberant. She loves taking these people down. She's not grim. She really enjoys what she's doing. This kind of giving is good or better than you get is a crucial aspect of high dominance politics. The Democrats have shrunk from it. And I think this is a huge problem for the party today. It's easy to say we don't want to go low. When they go low, we're going to go high. The fact is that if you keep going high, you can go high in terms of defending, justice and democratic causes while they defend, plutocracy and injustice. But when it comes to actual tactics, to try to simply take the nicknames without coming up with anything entertaining and provocative in terms of your own nicknames for your opponent, that's a huge mistake. And I have a big section on this in the book.
We're talking with Professor M. Stephen Fish, political scientist, University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of the new book, Comeback, Routing Trumpism, Reclaiming the Nation, Restoring Democracy's Edge. And when did this book come out?
Just a few weeks ago.
And what's been the response to it? Has it been productive of interviews on mass media, NPR, PBS, reviewed in the LA Times, New York Times. What's the reaction?
Well, there's been good reaction so far. I've been happy with it. I'm delighted to be on your podcast today. I've been on a number of other podcasts and have others scheduled. And for the most part, the feedback has been very positive. There are many people who, especially among Democrats, who say, again, we don't want to be like them. They're squeamish about dominance. The book also makes the case that we need to be superior patriots. We need to take the flag back from these guys. And there is a squeamishness about patriotism on the left as well. And in the book, I try to convince people that if you don't propound your own liberal, inclusive brand of patriotism, that you're going to end up leaving the flag in the hands of the ethno-nationalists. That is, those who actually treat, some people as superior by virtue of their skin color, the religion, the recentness of their citizenship. And the Democrats have gotten squeamish about nationalism, patriotism, and that this has really redounded to our harm as well.
Well, you mentioned some good examples by the Democrats. Tell us about the governor of Kentucky.
So the governor of Kentucky, I'm from Kentucky myself, and he's an example of what I think of as a very effective kind of, strong leader. Call him a high dominance politician too. Now, it's a very different high dominance style than someone like Jasmine Crockett, who's all like spice and sauce, right? And really in your face. Andy Beshear's style is very different, but he's also a high dominance politician. First of all, he doesn't just tell you what he thinks you want to hear. He tells you what he believes. So, for example, he's governing a red state, a deep red state, Kentucky. And yet, if you look at his policies, you might think that he governs as a kind of Republican appeasing, conservative Democrat, but he doesn't at all. One of his first acts when he was first elected about 5 years ago was to reopen the Planned Parenthood clinic in Louisville. He vetoed an abortion ban. It was overridden, but he vetoed it. He stood up for trans kids' rights. He enters the culture wars. He, every night during COVID, he did his Andy's nightly COVID briefing, and he would read out the names of Kentuckians who had succumbed to the disease, and he would chide people for not getting vaccinated. He passed a mask mandate, which the Supreme Court overruled. But the fact is, Andy is very liberal, and he's always out there doing his liberal thing. And you might think, oh my God, how does this guy get elected in Kentucky and reelected? Well, Kentuckians might not agree with all his policies, but they respect his commitment to principle. They respect his sincerity. And he was just reelected in a state that Trump won by 26 points, by 5 points over a Mitch McConnell protege just a matter of months ago. So he is an example of a very effective, strong Democrat ruling in or governing in a red state by virtue of the fact that he is a very courageous, principled politician. And even if people don't agree with his stances, they still really respect him.
Well, is Biden starting to get the message, given his reference to the other guy or the other fellow numerous times in the State of the Union address?
He might be. You see these little hints of dominance politics on Biden's part. The State of the Union address was definitely a step in the right direction. It's kind of Republican owning address. Then his, the way he challenged Trump on the debates and the Make My Day and I Hear You're Free on Wednesday nights, humor, exuberance, real challenge to Trump. That was good too. The fact that his staff leaked the very salty language he uses to describe Trump in private. These are the kinds of things that get media attention. After these things happen, it was not Biden in the news. He controlled the narrative for a few days. These are acts of high dominance. Whether he's going to keep this up, though, is another thing. That's not the MO of this party these days. Another thing a high dominance politician does is crow about his or her accomplishments constantly, aggressively take credit for his or her accomplishments. The Democrats have been abysmal at this. The economy is actually doing quite well, and more people think it's getting worse than think it's getting better. One thing I've noticed, Ralph, over time, as I've looked back at the data, is that people's attitude toward whether the president is doing a good job of managing the economy or not, and their economic confidence overall, is shaped much less by objective circumstances than by whether the party in power is constantly telling the people how good things are. So you look at economic confidence, and it was especially high under Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. It's much lower under Biden and Barack Obama. Well, objective circumstances don't explain that. Biden's economy today is every bit as good as Trump's economy ever was. The one thing Trump always latched on to is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And look at how you've got me to credit for all the roaring good times we have. The Dow is soaring far above Trump era levels right now. It's scraping this, hitting new records all the time. People don't know about it.
I've often told the Democrats here in Washington, you don't even know how to brag about your history. The Republican Party historically has been the party of no. Once the Civil War was over, they said when they were formed in 1854, they were the party of no against slavery. But after that, they're the party of no against labor unions, no against progressive taxation, no against Medicare, no against Social Security, no against environmental health regulation, no against consumer protection, no against raising the minimum wage. No, no, no. And the Democrats, in those examples at least, were yes, yes, yes. And they never brag about it. They never tell people. Even farmers who are voting overwhelmingly in rural states for Republicans, they never say to the farmers, who do you think brought you all this agricultural extension service? Who do you think brought you all those price supports? It was all Democrats opposed by the Republicans. So there's obviously a psychological component here. Do you think that's beyond your skill set, or do you want to contemplate this kind of immolation?
No, Ralph, I think this is absolutely key. And I've got a lot of material in the book on this. The Democrats have a glorious history, really, of the whole last century of always being the party of yes, the Republicans always being the party of no. And yet people don't realize that practically everything that's made America, the beacon and the kind of hope of the world, if I could, place it in kind of hyperbolic language, is progressive politicians supported by a kind of justice-minded citizenry pushing forward and getting things done. And every progressive program that we are now fighting a rearguard action to support to guard today was pushed through by these high dominance Democratic leaders, starting with FDR and going for the most part through LBJ. We have a glorious story to tell about our party. The economy almost always does better under the Democrats. To pick another example, now one politician who did a very good job of credit claiming and always let you know what his party was bringing you and how well he was doing was Bill Clinton. So if you think back to his nomination speech of Obama in 2012, Obama did a very poor job of conveying how well he had done, how much good he'd done with the economy. The guy arguably saved the world from another Great Depression in 2009, gave us health care in 2010, and so on. And most Americans didn't know it going into 2012. Bill Clinton gets up at his nomination speech for Obama, and in 40 minutes, he explains everything Obama had ever done for us, everything the Democratic Party had ever done for us, the superiority of the Democratic Party as a bringer of prosperity. And finally, even political scientists like me said, well, that's why we're supposed to vote for Barack Obama, right? Clinton explained it. He was extremely good at doing this. He brought in the details, but all the wonkery was just a flex. It's just showing you how smart he is and how he eats Republicans for lunch, right? And the Democrats are very bad at that kind of credit claiming these days. And in the book, I get into why that might be the case. There's this kind of cult of empathy it's well-intentioned, but I think it's politically dysfunctional, that's evolved in the party in the century, where Democrats seem to think that crowing about their own accomplishments and about all how much progress we've made in this country, whether it be on the economy or race or anything else, is somehow insensitive to those who still suffer. So there's a very good article by Michael Grunwald back in 2016 in the waning days of the Obama presidency, where he talks about the kind of messaging failures of the Obama administration. They did a very good job in many ways, but many people don't know the good things they brought us. And he talked about a messaging team that was constantly bridling Obama. And I've got a chapter on this in the book. Obama wanted to step out and talk about the great things that he was bringing. And his messaging team oftentimes told him, but Mr. President, our polling shows everybody isn't feeling the benefits yet. So rather than lead like Trump does and like Bill Clinton did and tell people how good things were and try to convince them, the Obama White House was always piping down and saying, well, we better not tell people how good things are because they might be offended or they're not feeling the benefits yet. You see signs of this in the Biden administration as well. And it's awful for our message because people simply don't know the great things the Democrats have done for them, to your point.
Of course, there's always the skeletons in the closet. A lot of politicians are like labor union chiefs. They don't want to tout their good news because it'll attract people to expose all the bad things they've done. And, Clinton and Obama did a lot of bad things, and they don't want to engage in that kind of exchange. All right, let's look at Trump. There's an article in the New York Times recently that said Trump is looking to create an outlaw image for himself and bond himself with the January 6th rioters and other outlaws. Has he finally crossed the line? Is he going to lose his image as a strong leader by being a serial law violator, a criminally convicted felon?
No, he can be a strong black hat leader, right? He can be a strong outlaw leader. And if you're going to beat a strong outlaw leader, you got to have a strong white hat leader. You've got to have a strong good guy, not a wimpy good guy, not someone who the outlaw can run rings around and own and dominate. That's just a fact. The Democrats seem to keep thinking that if we just shine the spotlight on Trump and focus attention on him, that finally people will see just how awful he is, and then they'll come vote for us. That's classic low dominance politics. Biden needs to be shining the spotlight on himself. Make it about himself. It's about you, Joe. It's not about Trump. Don't even take Trump seriously. Just ridicule him, right? The man was made to be ridiculed. And quit trying to make it about Trump, because to some extent, all publicity is good publicity.
Let's focus on the ridicule issue, because you're right. He's very, very sensitive to personal ridicule. So would you suggest that the Democratic Party side of this political contest start talking about him as Dangerous Donald, lock him up, Crooked Donald, Don the Con?
Yeah, Don the Con is good. Moscow Don is good. But things like, what was the first one you mentioned, Ralph?
Dangerous Donald.
Dangerous Donald. No, I would say that would be bad. His dangerousness is part of his appeal. That's part of his high dominance appeal. I don't think the Democrats should be in the business of trying to talk about how dangerous Trump is and how mean he is, how cruel he is, how callous he is. We do that all the time. Basically, high dominance leaders, they ridicule their opponents. If the opponents really deserve ridicule, as Trump certainly does. They're not just talking about how mean and heartless they are. They're talking about how pathetic they are. They're talking about how weak they are, how lame they are. Trump does that with his opponents, and that's part of his power, right? The Democrats start needing to do that with Trump. And the fact is, Ralph, if you really push back against these high dominance thugs like Trump, they will wilt, because at heart, all these high dominance authoritarians, whether you're talking about Trump or Putin or Hitler, are really wimps. They really are. What makes someone a high dominance authoritarian like a Putin or Hitler or Trump to begin with is deep insecurity and resentment and fear, egoic fear. And when high dominance good guys like MLK or LBJ or JFK push back, these guys can be run over faster than you can imagine. The problem is the Democrats don't do it.
Your point about dominance, once you get down the abstraction ladder, begins to fracture in terms of policy differences. And what I gather from the dominance issue is it's largely image manipulation over voters who aren't very well informed and are very vulnerable to these kinds of image manipulations. Let me give you examples. Trump was against extending the child tax credit, which was giving $300 a month to kids numbering 61 million, which includes conservative and liberal families, and was a lifesaver during the pandemic. Is that being strong? Trump is against labor unions. He hates labor unions. He doesn't want workers to organize. Is that being strong or weak? So I think the whole dominance thing begins to fracture with the onset of informed voters, wouldn't you say?
No, not at all. Not at all. Look, the reason Trump's able to get away with those crimes, and they are crimes, is that the Democrats aren't high dominance enough. The Democrats don't take what Trump did, which is stopping this tremendous Democrat Party sponsored achievement when it comes to lowering child poverty, which fell from 28% in 1993 to 5% in 2020 and 2021. In 2021, it took a big hit, 5%, very low child poverty rate. Then the Republicans and Joe Manchin, they get rid of the child tax credit, right? They scrap it. Child poverty goes back up to 12% the next year. Now, how did the Republicans get away with this? The Democrats let them get away with it. Their messaging is so low dominance that they don't step out and tell the story of all the great things they did to lower child poverty. Most people don't even know the number that Democrats, starting with Bill Clinton, did on child poverty in this country, because the Democrats won't step out and tell the story. That's a very low dominance move on their part. They're afraid of offending those who still suffer. then they won't take it to Trump and ridicule and eviscerate Trump and the Republicans for taking this particular aspect of public policy, which did so much good, and taking them to the mat for this. Most Americans don't even know how well the United States did on child poverty, or the fact that the Republicans eviscerated the credit, and that as a consequence, 4 million more kids are going to bed hungry tonight than were a few years ago, right? So the dominance argument doesn't fracture or crumble. On the contrary, this is an example of where you need high dominance leaders to achieve good things and beat back these monsters.
Okay, let's close the circle on this before we go to Steve and Hannah. The reason why I picked those two examples was because the Democrats don't have to tell people about that. When their check stopped, and they know why the check stopped, parents of 60 million children should know how to identify strength in political parties and representatives. They don't have to be told. The check stops, and they knew who chops the checks. When it comes to labor unions, you have a third of the labor workers voting for Trump. They know fully that Trump wants to weaken the NLRB, wants to crush labor unions, wants to stop people from joining labor unions. That's the way he ran his business as a failed gambling czar. They don't have to be told. To what extent do you put any responsibility on voters who know what strength is in their own perceived benefits, such as a child tax credit and labor union organizing rights?
Sure. I mean, I think some voters make decisions that I would disagree with. I just don't know how far that gets. What I want to do is win in November and every November and save democracy in this country. So what I'm concerned is, what can the Democratic Party do to ensure that? And again, take the child tax credit. I'm really glad you brought this up, because what polling showed at the time that Biden's child tax credit was getting beefed up was that most people actually liked it. Fully 40% of Americans who got the child tax credit said it made a major impact in their financial situation. And yet when you poll people about who was to credit for the child tax credit, only 37%, if I recall the numbers right, credited Biden. Only 40% or so credited the Democratic Party, even though this was entirely a Democratic Party operation. This is a product of their low dominance politics. They didn't get out there and crow about the great things that they had brought the country. Consequently, as many Republicans got credit for the child tax credit as Democrats did, because the Democrats' messaging machine never got out front and said, we did this for you, let's hold it together, and then told a glorious story about the decline in child poverty, which of course then would have increased public support for it. This is how you govern effectively. This is what LBJ did. The Democrats these days are so squeamish about taking credit and about telling stories of grand national progress that people don't even know what's going on, all the progress we've made, or the fact that the Democrats are to credit for it.
I want to put another example on the table. Was Trump exhibiting strength when he ridiculed in the early critical weeks the COVID epidemic and compared it to a flu, and people would get over in a couple days? And over 350,000 people's lives could have been saved, according to subsequent retroactive analysis by health specialists. Was he projecting weakness or strength? And where does amnesia play in this in terms of the public?
Look, this is a sign of Trump's profound weakness, in my view, that he would do this. The problem is that the Democrats did not get out there and make sure people knew this was a sign of Trump's weakness, his fearfulness, his egomania, right? And until the Democrats leverage Trump's disasters, including on COVID, they're not going to be able to take advantage of, at the polls, all these awful things that Trump does. This is where, again, you're back to dominance politics. If you can't take it to your opponent and blame them successfully, take credit for what you've done, then Trump's going to be able to get away with these things, right? We can blame voters and we can talk about voter ignorance, but most people don't pay that close of attention to politics. And so I don't really blame them for not knowing. What I do is blame Democratic Party elites for not getting the message out and playing on emotions properly to bring people around to our way of thinking.
Well, I don't see any leading Democrat accusing Trump of costing 350,000 lives and reminding people of how weak a leader he was at a point of pandemic's commencement.
Ralph, that's part of my whole point. You're exactly right about that. You don't see that. And that's precisely what a strong Democrat like John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or President Lula of Brazil, for example, would be doing. I'm a comparative political scientist. I don't just study the United States, I look at other countries. And I'm going to take President Lula of Brazil, who beat their Trump, that is Jair Bolsonaro, last year and saved democracy in Brazil. Bolsonaro calls himself the Trump of the tropics. He's just their Trump. Lula came along, and Lula, during his campaign, ridiculed and eviscerated Bolsonaro for his Trump-like COVID policies, which also cost hundreds of thousands of lives in Brazil. The Democrats don't do that. The Democrats refrain from that kind of hardcore behavior. Lula actually calls his East Bolsonarista opponents fascist and neo-fascist. He calls them what they are. In the last presidential election, he said, this isn't left versus right. It's democracy versus fascism. It's democracy versus authoritarianism. If Biden adopted that kind of rhetoric and told the truth, I think he would be in much better shape. And I think the notion of a Trump second term would seem fanciful. Lula, I think we have a lot to learn from that Brazilian president, as well as from some other leaders abroad that I deal with.
But what you're saying is the Democrats have got to learn the Madison Avenue mantra. If you want to get a message across, you have to have jackhammer repetition with all kinds of imagery and facts, and you got to keep doing it.
That's another important
again
point.
And again.
That's another important point. And, the thing is, the Democrats, especially these well-educated, highly educated people from the coast who run Democratic Party messaging, we don't like, liberal elites don't like repeating ourselves too often. We view it as kind of tacky, right? The fact is, effective political messaging will tell you the same thing every day and hammer it home, because most people don't pay that close attention to politics and not be squeamish about that. That's what Trump does. That's what strong leaders do. Neuroscientists and linguists tell us that, in order to actually bring people around, you've got to say your truth a million times. Maria Ressa, the great Nobel-winning prize enemy of disinformation in the world, said, if you tell a lie a million times, it becomes a fact. The great cognitive linguist, George Lakoff, talks about this as well. He talks about how Trump, with his repetition of this big lie, has actually changed people's brains. There's a reason why a third of the population believes this, because Trump is out there telling us he won every day. And how often do you hear the big truth uttered by Biden? How often do you hear Biden get out there and tell the glorious story of his victory and say, this portends my kicking more Republican butt in November of 2024, telling us the story of his win, 51-47 in the popular vote, 72 electoral votes. If Biden was out there repeating these truths as often as Trump repeats his lies, I think sustaining the big lie would be much harder to do.
What you're saying is the Democrats keep giving Trump the gift of unrebutted soliloquy.
That's very well put, Ralph. I wouldn't have put it that poetically myself, but I think you nailed it.
On that point, we're out of time. We've been speaking with Professor Stephen Fish, political scientist, University of California, Berkeley, author of the new book, Come Back, Routing Trumpism, Reclaiming the Nation, and Restoring Democracy's Edge, end quote. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Ralph. It's a real pleasure to join you.
We've been speaking with Professor M. Stephen Fish. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, on June 8th, 1967, the USS Liberty, a sophisticated intelligence vessel, was attacked by Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats, killing 34 young American men and wounding another 171. When we come back, we'll ask, was the USS Liberty attacked intentionally? But first, let's check in with our dogged corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 31, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Department of Justice last week filed an antitrust lawsuit against Live Nation Ticketmaster for its monopoly power over the live event supply chain, including the primary ticket selling market, concert promotions, and major venues. The complaint alleges that Live Nation has reinforced its monopoly power through exclusive dealing, tying of large amphitheaters and concert promotions, and the splitting of markets with potential competitors. In response, the American Economic Liberties Project said the following: today is a historic, long-awaited day for fans, artists, and independent businesses in the live events industry. The Department of Justice is officially seeking to break up one of America's most infamous monopolies. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Hannah Feldman. And Ralph, In the midst of the 1967 war between Israel and Egypt, Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats attacked the USS Liberty, an intelligence vessel cruising in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Egypt. The attack killed 34 American men and wounded 171 more. Our next guest was aboard that ship when it all went down. Anna?
Phil Turney served aboard the USS Liberty as a Navy petty officer on June 8, 1967, when the Liberty was attacked by Israeli planes and torpedo boats. He is president of the USS Liberty Veterans Association, which was established to provide support for survivors of the attack. The efforts of the LVA are also focused on ensuring the U.S. government finally conducts the public investigation of the attack on the USS Liberty. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Phil Turney.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that very much, being on the show, and I'll start off with a little bit about the Six-Day War.
Yes, go ahead, Phil. Tell our listeners how this war came about before we get to the attack on the Liberty by the Israeli armed forces.
Yes, sir, I sure will. We were in Africa at the time, in Abidjan, Africa. We got emergency orders to go to the Eastern Mediterranean. We didn't know what was going on until we got underway and got to the Rock of Gibraltar and found out the war had already been started a little early. We got there on, I believe, the third or the fourth day of the war. And the Israeli Defense Forces had taken out all of the Jordanian, Egyptian airplanes, and they'd captured land. They've done, I mean, the war was essentially over when we got there on June the 8th. Actually, we got there on the 7th, but on the 8th is when we got attacked.
And the Israelis expanded their territory. As a result, they took control of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights in Syria. And as you say, they had essentially won the war. And the USS Liberty was a communication ship. It was not geared for naval battles, and it went into that area off the coast. How many miles were you off the coast, and was your skipper in touch with the Israelis at the time before the attack?
We were approximately 12.5 miles off the Sinai Peninsula in international waters, our flag flying. Beautiful, beautiful day, holiday colors. I mean, everything was beautiful. Everything going on the shore. I mean, we were 12 miles off, so you could see the bombs dropping and everything. But as far as I know, no, the captain had no communication with the Israelis or the Egyptians at all.
And suddenly, you started getting bombed by relays of Israeli fighter planes. These were U.S.-provided fighter planes. And describe the onset of the attack and what the reaction was by people on the ship.
Oh, absolutely. First, if I might say, the Israelis reconned our ship for over and over and over for hours. They identified our ship as American and friendly even before they did the attack. In fact, the airplanes got so close to us, the recon airplanes, we would wave at the pilots and they'd wave back at us. They'd dip their wings like everything was fine. And we felt perfect about that because our Israeli friends were there. I mean, they were our allies. We had Stars of David all over the ship. Of course, I'm not Jewish, but there were Star of Davids. We wanted them to win. You know, they're our allies, we thought. But the attack started around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June the 8th. We were attacked by Steer Mirage jets, unmarked jets. We didn't know who was attacking. This went on for about 20, 25 minutes, the air attack. And again, our flag was always flying. They knew who we were. They identified us as American and attacked us anyway. But I do want to add, we were sent there by LBJ to be sunk by the IDF and blame it on the Arabs. That was the whole plan, for us to go to the bottom. But we didn't go to the bottom, messed up everything for them. By the grace of God, we stayed alive.
Well, the result was that the Israeli military killed 34 soldiers, injured over 170, and pretty much wrecked the ship. And the ship had no anti-aircraft capability. Is that correct?
No, Ralph, they did not. We had 450 caliber machine guns. We had two forward, that's on the forecastle, very forward part of the ship, one port, one starboard, then midships, one port, one starboard, 50 caliber machine gun mounts. They were all taken out on the first pass. Within 3 seconds, we lost all of our communications. They took out the 4 gun mounts. We were defenseless. Of course, a 50 caliber machine gun against a jet aircraft is absolutely, it doesn't mean anything anyway. The only thing those guns were for repel boarders in case somebody tried to board our ship. And that was it, not to fight a war. We were a non-combatant ship, the most sophisticated spy ship in the world.
And how long was this attack? And what was going on during the attack? You must have been totally vulnerable and wondering what was happening and asking for help from the U.S. Navy and Air Force. Tell us, how long was the attack? And I understand it involved torpedo boats. Is that right?
Yes, it is. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours, as long as the attack on Pearl Harbor. They took out all of our tuning antennas except one, so we couldn't get a message out to anybody. And we did get one hooked up by a sailor named Terry Halbardier. He got a long wire strung so we could get out a message. And they were jamming all of our frequencies that we had, distress frequencies, everything. The only way we got it out is when they were firing their missiles at us, but it couldn't jam us anymore. So we got a signal out, to the 6th Fleet. Captain Tully sent aircraft off the USS Saratoga immediately. They were recalled by McNamara, says, do not go to help the Liberty. Return to base. Return to base, and that's what they did.
Well, this was the first truly egregious abandonment of Washington, of sailors in this case, involving hostilities by the Israelis. At the time, the news reports, Phil, predicted that Israel was going to have to really pay a penalty, a political penalty, a diplomatic penalty, and an economic penalty, and they had to come forward with a full explanation. And there were people in Congress calling for it as well. So what happened? How could Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and Admiral McCain, who is Senator John McCain's father, and Lyndon Johnson, president, how could they all basically abandon you? Can you explain?
Well, I can. They all abandoned us for one reason. They wanted us to sink, as I said before, and blame it on Nasser. They hated Nasser. They wanted to take him out. They wanted to get control of more land than they're getting right now, or they got in 67, and they're getting a lot more now. But this to our attack, we never did get any help from anybody. When they knew we were under attack by our own government, they recalled the airplanes not once, not twice, but 3 times. They recalled the rescue aircraft, return to base. Liberty doesn't need any help. They left us out there for 17 hours with a 40 by 40 torpedo hole in us. We're almost sinking. And with 850 cannon rocket holes in our ship, napalm burning us up, 5,000 armor piercing in our ship, and the whole mess deck was full of a sea of men, bloody, body parts missing. I can't explain the carnage that went on, but that ship, all of us came together, all the spies, all the ship's company, we all come together, and we, by the grace of God, as I said before, we were just as servants that day. We saved that ship. To tell the truth, and we were ordered by Admiral Isaac Kidd never to say anything about it. He boarded our ship and told us to shut up, or we'd end up in prison, fined, or worse. We all know what worse meant, death. That's what they told us, to shut up. They took away our First Amendment rights, and Congress has not done a darn thing 57 years. The line is, it was a case of mistaken identity. That's where they left it. And reparations paid to the ship was $6 million. Most of the crew got $200. The most serious wounded got a little bit more.
Well, I know some of our listeners are saying, what was the real motive for Israelis to do this? This is their major ally, their major military supplier, the U.S. What was their motive to do it? And whatever their motive was, how did they think they could get away with it in terms of American public opinion and outrage?
Well, that's a good question, but they did get away with it. They silenced it. The media silenced it. We were on the front page one day, on the 4th page the next day, and on the last page the very 3rd day. So it was all covered up. We weren't allowed to speak about it. I mean, I was only a 20-year-old guy then, and I was dressed down by a flag admiral to keep my mouth shut, or I'd end up in prison or worse. And I told the admiral, I said, he asked me, he says, what really happened? And I told him I saw a machine gun in the life rafts, napalm, shooting on deck. I was wounded myself. I was a walking wounded, and they didn't care none about that. The only narrative one was stake and identity.
All right, let's look at the
Former,
truth seekers here. Was there a congressional hearing, number one?
Never. There never has been a congressional hearing, no matter what the Congress tell you. If you write them, prepare to be lied to. Be prepared to be lied to because they lie about the USS Liberty. There never has been a congressional investigation. The only investigation we ever got was a board of inquiry, which took 7 days, when it should have taken a year to investigate this thoroughly. They took the word of their attackers only because Johnson, Levy Askell, and their minions came together to send our ship out there, be sunk, and blame it on Nasser. That was the whole plan.
Nasser was the head of Egypt at the time, and Eshkol was the prime minister of Israel. Now, it was a board of inquiry by the Department of Defense?
No, by Admiral Kidd, who worked directly for Admiral McCain, as you mentioned earlier, and Ward Boston. He was the JAG officer, the captain lawyer. They came aboard, and they did the investigation, and Admiral Starring, he was a former Judge Advocate General of the United States for the Navy. They took that away from him. He was a captain then. He became Judge Advocate. But anyway, he says, I can't approve this. I can't approve it because the facts, what the testimony says, don't add up. So I won't sign off on it. So they took it. They had somebody sign off on it. 7 days, it's done.
And your group has a website. You want to describe that?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Ralph. It's ussliberty.org, ussliberty.org. You can access all of our documents, statements, and just general things. So many things on there that will lighten.
A few days ago, Phil, we checked in to see where the USS Liberty was, because in other contexts, it would be in the port as a memorial, and people could go visit it and learn about this attack by an ally, no less, that still was never explained fully, and the attackers never held accountable. And we learned that it was scrapped in 1973. Why was it scrapped instead of kept as a memorial by the U.S. Navy?
Because they wanted no record or nothing to come up about the USS Liberty. Done, dead story. From June 8th, 1967 to this very day, the 29th. In fact, today is my wife's birthday. Happy birthday to her. But the 29th of this month, we have not, for 57 years, nothing has come about. We get stonewalled by our Congress. Every president from LBJ to Biden will not touch us. The Congress will not touch us.
Well, usually when there's such a cover-up and such secrecy and such exclusion of people who have a right to know, there's a story behind the story that people are desperate not to have come out. What do you think the story behind the story is?
The story behind the story is what they did to us. The story is the United States and the world needs to know the truth about June 8, 1967. There were tactical nukes on the way to Cairo. Tactical nukes that were already in the air on the way to Cairo if our ship, before our ship even sank. That's how confident they were the Israelis were going to sink us. They fired 5 torpedoes at us and only one hit. 5 and only one hit, and almost sunk us. So in other words, they had war plans they didn't want disclosed and transmitted by the communication capabilities of the USS Liberty. Is that fair to say? I would say that's fair to say. I will say this, though, that David Lewis, our lieutenant then at the time, he was the communications officer. He ran all the CIA and NSA people down there. And he's told this story before. He's passed on now. But he was ordered, if we were to pick up anything from United Kingdom or Israeli transmissions, to drop them immediately, not to listen into them.
Could you tell our listeners the best 2 books on the subject? Because they may want to read a book on it, not just look at the documentary.
Yes, Operation Cyanide by Peter Hannum. Operation Cyanide by Peter Hannum. And there's another good one, Attack on the Liberty by James Scott.
Well, there you are, listeners. Anything else you want to say before we close?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Ralph, and the crew there, all of you. Thank you for your help. And I might add, the USS Liberty crew is the most decorated ship in United States history for a single engagement. We've got medals from the Medal of Honor all the way down to Purple Hearts, I mean, there's just so many I can't explain, but it's the most decorated crew, and nobody knows about it.
Well, the 4-hour documentary should help inform people. Tell us its title again.
Sacrificing Liberty. Go to sacrificingliberty.com or just type in Sacrificing Liberty and it'll come up. You can rent it, watch it on your TV or computer, or just get the 4-hour series. But they'll mail it.
There you are, listeners. The good start. Should never forget the USS Liberty. We've been talking with Phil Torney, who was a petty officer on the USS Liberty when it was attacked, with great casualties among U.S. sailors in June 1967. Phil is the current president of the USS Liberty Veterans Association, which wants to remind Americans never to forget what happened to the USS Liberty and why. Thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you. God bless everybody. Have a great, great day and the rest of the week. Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Professor M. Stephen Fish and Navy Petty Officer Phil Turney. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. And a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Anna Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, and remember, the Capitol Citizen is for you. You can become a Capitol Citizen reading the Capitol Citizen print-only newspaper. 40 pages packed. Go to capitolcitizen.com to obtain a copy or copies for your own civic circle.
Oh, you should step up, step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up and